question, and it's about the difference between banks in this founding era and
Yeah.
banks today, how they differ, and how we can, help to explain that to students. So what's the basic sort of difference? And part of this, I think, is the difference between the national bank and maybe the Federal Reserve today, but also just your average bank.
Okay. Well, I think that the central bank, which we didn't talk about those details yet, so I don't want to sort of jump the gun here, but the central bank in some ways is trying to be like the Fed is today, because it is trying to do economic operations that only the national government can accomplish. And it is not the early Fed, but it is sort of tending in that direction. But when it comes to sort of ordinary banking activities, I don't know, I'm not a scholar of early republic banks, but from what I'm thinking of, they're kind of similar. Most of them are chartered by the states themselves. So the national bank that Hamilton will propose, the Bank of the United States, is the outlier because it's chartered at the federal level. Most banks are chartered by the states in this period, but there are very many fewer banks. I think in 1789, there's something like 4 state banks across the early republic. And another difference between then and now would be that they're not capitalized nearly as big as they are today. So they don't have very much money to loan out. And Hamilton, again, when we get to the bank conversation later on, Hamilton will want to change that with the central bank and give it a lot of money so that it has more economic power in its ability to make loans and issue banknotes. So in that sense, banking is similar to today, and the functions of state banks in terms of having individual accounts and issuing banknotes like checks today, that's the same. The banks back in the early republic have to have a certain amount of gold and silver on reserve to back up the money that they're issuing. And that is similar to today, not quite the same, but the banks today do have to have a certain reserve in them. So there are definitely similarities.
Yeah, and I like the way that you explain bank notes as being kind of like the equivalent today of checks, because that's kind of a complicated concept, because there wasn't greenbacks necessarily until later in the 19th century. There wasn't money, and so the currency circulating are these bank notes.
Right, and bills of exchange, which are also like checks, not checks, but they're like them. So you're right. So a banknote would be something that's like currency because you can go to that bank that issued it and say, give me gold and silver. That means that this paper note has value and can therefore circulate. And as I will say later on in the bank part of this talk, Hamilton counts on that, because a central bank that's located all over the United States can do so much more for helping to circulate those banknotes and cashing them in. And that's really helpful as a national institution.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a handful of questions about the necessary and proper clause. And
okay, we're getting to that later. Hold off.
You want to wait? We can wait on those.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, we absolutely can do this. One that has shot up. This is David Scott's question. So all of the necessary and proper questions, we're gonna get to those. So don't worry. David Scott asks, John Adams and Abigail Adams invested a lot of money in purchasing the Continental IOUs during the early months of the debate on paying face value of the debt. It keeps moving because people are voting. I gotta find it. I know that John Adams was in Europe at the time, but there was some kind of relationship or discussion between the Adamses and Hamilton during this time. John and Abigail made a massive fortune from face value payments. How did this affect their friendship with the other founders? So we're getting into some real internal.
Yeah, and to tell you the truth, I don't know what that communication was. I mean, I know that Adams and Hamilton sort of always kind of were wary of each other, and later on will amount to like open hatred of each other. But I don't know specifically how that particular transaction played into that dynamic. I have never heard any speculation, though, that there was anything even suggestion of insider trading where Hamilton gave like a tip to the Adamses. I've never heard of that. So I would say then it sounds like what was going on was a good bet from the Adamses, not improperly facilitated by Hamilton, and I am not sure how that affected their dynamic. I mean, I would hope that John Adams would be pleased with Hamilton because they made such a windfall.
You would think
right?
they would have gotten along better, right?
Right. But that didn't play out in the long run. So.
And I will say, those of you that have been to a lot of these Humanities Texas workshops on early American history, Woody Holton, one of the greats, has written about this issue in the context of Abigail Adams and her financial speculation, and so his biography of Abigail Adams is good on that issue. So I'm gonna go to the question. I voted this one up, and I think everyone's probably curious about this. Tell us about your take on Hamilton the musical. What it does well, where it's maybe lacking, and obviously it can't cover the issues that you've just covered, so deeply. But how do you feel about how it does on these issues and other things?
I think Hamilton the musical is great. And I know that there have been a lot of critiques of the musical from historians because of the way it doesn't handle slavery very deeply, for example. And I'm not sure that I love how the Hamilton's relationship with the Schuyler women is depicted as well. I think that's a little bit of trying to play that up for the story. But overall, I love the musical, and I think it's not trying to be a lecture, so I don't expect that of it. And I actually think it does a good job of covering Hamilton's early political interactions, Hamilton's policies. When I teach this in my own class, I play Cabinet Battle 1 because it's so relevant, So I think it's actually like a really great tool, and I would never think that the critiques you can make outweigh nearly the value that it provides, with one exception. I'm a legal historian. Denver, you so kindly held up my book earlier, and thank you. And I would, not ever think that the Hamilton the musical should cover Hamilton's, the nitty gritty of his cases. However, there is a line where Hamilton is addressing Aaron Burr, who is also a lawyer in the New York legal scene. And Hamilton says something to the effect of, Aaron Burr is the best lawyer around. And there is absolutely no way that Hamilton would really say that. Okay, Hamilton was definitely the finest lawyer in New York, according to him. So I take issue with that.
Yeah, another fallacy in that exchange is when he asks Aaron Burr to help write the Federalist Papers, which there's no evidence at all for
of Aaron Burr. However, though, not with the Federalist Papers, but there was collaboration between Burr and Hamilton on legal cases. So there were oftentimes, the New York legal scene was such, different from today. The New York legal scene was such that when you were a lawyer, you did all of the law. You weren't one kind of lawyer. So Hamilton would pair up with Burr to represent, let's say, an insurance provider, the United Insurance Company, for example. And then on another case, he would be working against Aaron Burr on a contract dispute. So he would be opposing counsel. And it was just really fluid like that. So definitely a lot of collaboration with Aaron Burr, but not with the Federalist Papers, no.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer. And tomorrow I'm going to be doing a little bit with The Room Where It Happens, and so we'll get a little bit more of the musical tomorrow.
Oh, okay.
So Jonathan Evans has a fun question that I think is really useful, because I think in different parts of American history, it's useful to compare different programs and different ideas. And his question is, how does Hamilton's plan to deal with debt relate to FDR's relief, recovery, and reform during the Great Depression? Are there similarities? And I might even extend that a little bit into today. And debt is a big issue today, and how we, might think of Hamilton in terms of our own historical moment.
Okay, well, one similarity across all of those periods you mentioned that I can think of is that Hamilton was not afraid of debt, and he did not see it as an immoral failing. There was a morality attached to debt in the 18th century, but also he didn't see it as a problem that would like hinder you. To the contrary, Hamilton saw debt as sort of an engine that actually could gin up economic activity. And he famously, he calls it a national blessing, and that's what he's getting at with that sentiment. Hamilton's initial plan when it comes to the debt was not to pay it down all the way. He wanted to follow the example of Great Britain and just service the interest payments and sort of keep this enormous amount of principal sort of floating along over time. And it happened that there was so much tax revenue eventually that he could pay down the debt, and later presidents will, not that Hamilton is a president, but later presidents like Andrew Jackson will ultimately pay down that debt. But he wasn't afraid of carrying a big debt with him. And that would be similar to today and FDR, who, when Congress says we are going to generate economic activity by going into debt, the idea there is that you will do more good, create more wealth by doing it than you will by just sort of having this debt outstanding. Because the federal government is in that position to do something like that. That all being said, differences include Hamilton was not trying to generate, he wasn't trying to keep people employed, and he wasn't trying to sort of carry all of the extra baggage that we have today along with him on this program. And what I mean by that is keeping people employed, stimulating GDP. Eventually he would want that, but not in the current moment. He's trying to restore the public credit. That's number one for him. And currently in the United States, our credit worthiness is good. So there's a sort of mismatch there. Hamilton also, in his plan, doesn't have the complexity of reform that FDR, for example, has. A part of the New Deal was to reform institutions like the stock market, which doesn't exist when Hamilton is formulating this plan. And FDR is also interested in expanding the power of government over all different aspects of the US economy, like agriculture, and with his works programs. And Hamilton's program is just nowhere as ambitious. Mm-hmm. So there's definitely overlap, but there also are differences. And, I think that's useful for comparison, but they're not one and the same at all, not really.
Yeah, maybe something that could be a building block throughout the year while you're teaching about these things. So I think we have time for one more, and maybe I'll try to combine the sentiment in several of the questions. And for inspiration, I'm going all the way to the bottom of my list, at least. Jesse Hernandez, an underappreciated question here that's asking about Hamilton's relationship with Adam Smith's idea of laissez-faire. But I just kind of want to expand that a little bit bigger to just kind of ask you whether you really see Hamilton as the father of American capitalism. And if so, there's a lot of questions here about Jefferson and Madison and what they're thinking. Is it just that Hamilton was so much more forward thinking than those two, or do you see, limits in Hamilton's, economic vision? And I guess you just spelled out some of them, but maybe just take some of that gobbledygook and make sense of it.
Well, so let me start with the relationship to Adam Smith. Hamilton had definitely read Adam Smith, and I would definitely say he was influenced by Smith's laissez-faire mindset. However, we should keep in mind that what Adam Smith is writing against is the very heavy regulation and prescriptive economic policy of the British Empire, which tried to smother free trade within the empire. And Adam Smith was like, no, 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 that's not the way to do it. Alexander Hamilton is not proposing mercantilistic policies. So in that sense, he absolutely adopts Smith's sort of, yeah, let's trade freely. Let's trade with Great Britain. Let's trade with France. Let's do this. Let's get the tax revenue. And so in that sense, he's right along with Adam Smith. But he is also not in line with a free market where there's no government regulation. Obviously, he's not on board with that. Hamilton is all about the federal government using its own powers to encourage economic activity. I just spent 40 minutes talking about how he wanted to do that, right? So he is of Adam Smith, but he is also not of free market, laissez-faire principles that we might apply today.
That was a great answer. I think that was a great answer, actually.
Okay.
I think you nailed it. I think you helped us show why we can't draw straight lines from these figures to the parties today, because I think the Democratic Party and the Republican Party today both inherit ideas of Hamilton and Jefferson. That's not
Totally true.
I mean, it's a big mixture, and so we got to be careful of that. But it's interesting, I think, to see the different directions the ideas go, for sure. Well, this was fantastic. We're